If you struggle with unseen poetry, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Now, when it comes to poetry, remember that poets write any form of poetry to reflect the human experience, to reflect their thoughts on issues in society, even society at large, to reflect their feelings on things like nature. And when it comes to any unseen poem that you get, and indeed, to be honest, even think about the set poems that you've got to study and revise and learn. When it comes to any poem, there are always 10 big ideas that influence poets when they are writing and expressing their thoughts on the human experience. Now, how do you apply this to unseen poetry, especially if you struggle with one and then the second poem that you've never seen before? Because obviously, remember, in unseen poetry, you always get 2 random poems that you've never seen before. You've got to analyze them on the spot and then write about them quite analytically and quite perceptively. Now, as I said, there's a little secret to doing really well with unseen poetry, and it is this. You need to get really familiar on the 10 big ideas that are most popular with poets, that influence what they write about in the poems that they write to reflect the human experience. By the way, use that phrase, reflection of a human experience, how the poets write to demonstrate and to reflect the human experience. The moment you use language like that, you are showing perceptiveness, you're showing analysis. Now, what I want to do to make your life super easy, regardless of whatever poem that you get in unseen poetry, you know what you can talk about, is I will give you the 10 most popular ideas that influence poets when they're writing poems. And of course, then when you're doing your unseen poetry, you scan the poem and then ask yourself, which one of these big ideas is this poem most likely writing about? The moment you think about that idea and the moment you spot that big idea, you then mention it in your writing. This is part of your interpretation. And bonus, if you look at the keywords in the question that you're given that accompany the unseen poem, and then you think about these big ideas, it's going to be ultra easy to spot the idea and immediately know what the poet is talking about. And then on top of that, get some amazing analysis points. So I'm going to run through the 10 big ideas that you will find in any unseen poem. When you read, pick out what idea you think it's about and then mention it in your response. So beginning with number 1, love or love and relationships. And of course, for those of you guys who are studying love and relationships anthology, you will of course be very familiar with this. Now, one thing I want to mention when it comes to this theme and this idea, which will also come up in any unseen poem that you could get, is love and even the idea of relationships isn't only in the romantic context. Remember that poets not only will be writing about love from, say, a romantic perspective, so, love, heartbreak with their lover and so on, but remember that love can also be to do with family relationships, right? So we love our parents, we love our siblings and so on, or even sometimes we fall out of love with them, we fall out with them. But equally, this aspect of relationships as well, which probably I should have added here, love and relationships, it's also to do with, for example, the breakdown of relationships and how one feels as a result of it. But love is a very, very popular theme to do with relationships. So this is romantic relationships, friendships, and so on. This is an idea you want to look out for in any unseen poem that you get. Now, the second idea is that to do with loss and grief. Again, this one is fairly self-explanatory, anything to do with death, right? And of course, again, don't interpret loss and grief only to do with death and somebody dying that, the writer felt was really important to them. Loss and grief can also be, for example, the loss of one's job, the loss of, one's home, or if somebody has to move from one place to another. But also, it can even be broader than that, to do with, for example, the loss of innocence, right? So some poems tend to write about, and some poets tend to write about somebody going from being a child to being an adult, or being a child to being a teenager, and the hardships that go with that, and the sense of loss and the feelings of loss that the person feels. When they look back to their childhood, they feel really nostalgic and they really miss that, and they're grieving their childhood. So remember, you don't narrowly interpret these ideas, broadly interpret them, okay? Now, the third big idea is to do with nature very popular with poets. I think that in and of itself just it kind of tells you exactly what it is, right? If there's any form of nature that's mentioned, trees and so on, or also nature being shown in a really scary way, well, you then mention how, you know, the poet demonstrates nature. And of course, also remember that there were some poets who really loved nature. And a long time ago, we call them the romantic poets that celebrated nature. But nature is a really common theme that you can expect to come up in your unseen poem. Now, the fourth big idea is to do, of course, with emotions, feelings, sadness, happiness, elation, confusion, right? Any form of emotions, if you identify and label that in the writing and in the poem even, you then will get marks for then talking about what emotions are being portrayed and why. And also, by the way, I've forgotten to mention that, of course, the unseen poems that you can get can be on one of these big ideas, but also sometimes they overlap, right? So for example, loss and grief overlaps really nicely with emotions, right? Because, you know, loss and grief, the accompanying emotions are to do with sadness. So also don't forget that some of these big ideas can also overlap, and more than one of these big ideas can be present in any unseen poem that you do. Next is to do with number 5, the idea of time and change. And remember, one of the themes when time is mentioned, the passage of time, or even, for example, if the poem is talking about morning versus evening, right, that even is still a direct reference to time. This idea of time and change is something that we as humans always push back against, right? And once more, remember that poems are always to do with the human experience. So one common theme that we see, especially in connection to time and change, is this kind of pushing back that the speaker feels against, why do things have to change? Why do I need to get old? Why does a morning turn into evening? How is the day gone, right? It can be lots of things, but this idea of time and change is something that you can definitely expect to come up in your unseen poem. And by the way, if you're obviously looking at this as I'm circling through these 10 ideas and you're thinking, okay, this is helpful, but if this idea were to come up and I correctly label it, what I really struggle with is then expanding, right? So I know what idea they're talking about, but how do I take it from knowing what the idea is to actually writing really well on this? If you struggle with your writing and your analysis of the unseen poetry, I am going to be running a one-off unseen poetry masterclass. This is going to be during October half-term week. Okay, so during October half-term week, this is going to be on a Friday at 5 p.m. I'm going to be having a one-off unseen poetry masterclass where not only am I going to be going over 2 GCSE questions, okay, so this is the 24-mark question as well as the 8-mark comparison question, but of course during that lesson, not only will we be going over live grade 9 model answers for unseen poetry so that you can know how to structure your responses, but also I'm going to be doing a really thorough recap on things like techniques, and of course, as this is a live lesson, you can ask me as many questions as you want. So make sure you join in. Now, the next big idea is to do, which is actually kind of a close cousin of time and past, is to do with memory and the past, right? This idea of yearning for the past, yearning for one's memory, okay? And even yearning for one's childhood, okay? So memory in the past, to be honest, is also quite closely related to time and change. Very popular idea and very popular theme that you can definitely expect to come up in unseen poetry. Now, the next idea, number 7, is to do with loneliness, this sense of not fitting in, this sense of isolation. We even call it alienation. This is a really, really common idea that you can definitely expect to come up in an unseen poem that you get. Then number 8 is obviously to do with identity. And when it comes to identity, it's usually to do with the sense of belonging, or also the sense of pride in one's country, in one's family, in one's heritage. And actually, a really good example of identity is any poems that show a sense of patriotism. Remember that patriotism is this idea of love for one's country, okay? So patriotic ideas, which are shown sometimes, for example, you might get like a war poem or a soldier, somebody talking about how amazing the country is. This is also an identity poem, okay? But obviously identity can be broader than that, or even lack of identity, not feeling like you fit in. That also is an identity poem, okay? Now, number 9 is to do with society. This is when poets write about maybe criticizing traditions, maybe criticizing inequality that they see in society when they're talking about a rich person versus a poor person, a man versus a woman, whatever it is. You can also anticipate poems that criticize or critique or observe society as a whole. And finally, this idea, which for those of you that are studying power and conflict, you're going to be very familiar with. This idea of conflict and power, which is very, very popular with poets, and you can certainly expect it and anticipate it in any unseen poem that you get. And of course, if you have any questions and you want to see how some of these ideas manifest in an actual essay, and if you have any questions about, okay, how do I structure unseen poetry? How do I even structure comparison? As I said, I'm going to be running a one-off unseen poetry masterclass during October half-term week. It's just 1 hour. It's always a vibe. And of course, you can ask me as many questions as you want. So I hope to see you there. Thank you so much for watching.